Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our Exploring Blue Culture. This webinar today is on reflections on history, culture, and the future of policing. Today, we're joined with our cultural anthropologists, Ken Price, Robert Adams, and joining us, special guest today, we have Barney Melekian. And we're joined by our Blue Courage Master Trainers. We have Michael, Nila, and Jack Hart, who I will turn it over to now. Thank you,
Good
Jack.
afternoon, Becky. Thank you so much for that introduction. And hello, everyone, and welcome. The most precious gift you can share, I think, with all of us is your time. So thank you so much for taking time out to join us on this webinar series as we continue to dive deeper into this question of culture and a roadmap for policing to transform it. So thanks again to the Blue Courage team and to the Thomas Leland team, back of house staff who got this webinar up and running, the website, and also collating the questions and getting wonderful speakers like Dr. Melekian today. In our first seminar entitled Foundations, our panel of police leaders and cultural anthropologists discussed the crisis in policing and made the case that a definitive understanding about and courageous action to intentionally shape positive culture are the defining value propositions you can bring to a police organization and how you experience it that moves it from the pain through the healing and into growth. Now, while we would of course love to tell you that we have all the answers here and that the concrete solutions are just one click into a webinar away, we are humble enough to admit that we don't have all the answers. And even if we did, if you agreed with 100% of everything that you've heard in these webinars, you probably aren't thinking about it deeply enough. While the series of webinars will lead to a blueprint, it is the discovery journey grounded in questions, not answers, that will illuminate the path forward, which will ignite transformation. Now, the first three questions posed by this panel were not grounded in use of force policy, defensive tactics, prisoner transportation procedures, or cultural sensitivity. Important for skills and tools training and development focused on the external stakeholders of policing, but the hard internal heart set and mindset questions foundational to internal organization trust and growth, maturity and transformation are how are we led, how are we acculturated, and how are we educated? On the Friday webinar called Voices from the Field, it was a treatise on dynamic, bold, and authentic heart-focused leadership practices with Houston Police Chief Art Acevedo. And today we will dive deeper into these three questions and ask many others with an expert who is both in the profession and above it as a policing leader, thought leader, and innovator. Quick introductions. In his 50th year in policing, Police Commander Emeritus and founder of Blue Courage, welcome Michael Nila. An applied cultural anthropologist and senior engagement leader, consultant, and managing partner with Thomas Leland. Please welcome Dr. Ken Price. A cultural anthropologist who specializes in diversity and inclusion, mindful leadership, organizational change, and strategic planning. Please welcome Dr. Robert Adams, Jr. And in his 40+ years of policing, and this CV is very abridged, former Pasadena Police Chief, Undersheriff of Santa Barbara County, presidential appointee as the Director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, AKA the COPS Office, Chairman of the Board of the National Police Foundation, and awardee of a doctorate in Policy, Planning, and Development from USC. Please welcome Dr. Barney Melekian.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you so much for all of you for being here. And Michael, I think you're probably the most excited person in the room to have Dr. Melekian here today.
No, absolutely. I absolutely love Barney. He is a friend, but even more than that, a mentor to me personally, but also to our entire profession. I know Barney probably doesn't remember this, but I knew of the Dr. Melekian, of course, but the first time we met, I was doing an executive overview at a PERF Major City Chiefs meeting on Blue Courage. And when I was finished, I was getting ready to leave, Barney came up to me and he said, "That is the most hopeful, promising thing I've heard about policing in decades." And I never forgot that moment, Barney, although you probably did. But since that time, he has been a great mentor for all of us on the Blue Courage team. He brought Blue Courage to Santa Barbara. He actually went through the train the trainer course himself. So he's deeply schooled in the principles, practices, and thesis of Blue Courage, and is a giant advocate for what we do. So of course I'm absolutely thrilled that he's here. But one of the things that I love the most about Barney is he is so reflective and thoughtful. He's what we would call a deep thinker. I think he's been referred to as as Yoda, the Yoda of policing, because of that deep thinking and reflection. And he is always asking the uncomfortable questions, you know, the questions that we aren't thinking of and that kind of make us squirm when they are asked. And because of that, he's absolutely the right person to help guide us through this exploration of culture, of leadership, and certainly of education, and where we are in this moment, where we've been, and where we go in the future. So welcome, Barney.
Thank you, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Well, we'll turn it over to Robert, who has the first question for Dr. Melekian.
Yes, you're known as one of the great advocates of organizational leadership and change in American policing. Can you share your approach to values-based policing as a substitute for rules-based policing?
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, thank you, Jack, for leading this, and Ken and Robert for being part of this. This is very exciting and very reflective of what Michael and Blue Courage do. I heard some time ago, and I think it was Michael Josephson who said that we really needed to change the fundamental question in the line officer's mind from "can I do this" to "should I do this?" And the notion of values-based policing and values-based discipline is predicated on the idea that the organization and the profession put forward a set of values. They say, this is what we stand for. But the disciplinary process, the rules-based process, the legalistic model that we operate in, particularly when we're trying to work through concepts like transparency and accountability, become very quickly this legal kabuki dance and have very little to do with, are you doing the right thing? Are you doing or did you do what you should have done in the moment? And I'm not naive. There's a conflict between trying to do a values-based approach in a legalistic world, but it can be done. It's been done at several police departments around the country, most notably outside of Pasadena, Boulder, Colorado, and I think there was a town in Illinois, and I'm drawing a blank on it right now. That have actually experimented with this concept and demonstrated its efficacy. And if we had more time, I'd go into some of the specific challenges and opportunities it presents. But it essentially says that it challenges the officer and the organization to live up to those things that they say that they stand for.
Yeah, such a great thing to aspire to. I as you said, Wheaton, Illinois, with a set of standardized principles and then training bulletins, for certain procedures that are mechanistic. Right. And I know, Michael, in lineups, you used to tell your officers in Aurora, if it ain't in the book and it's the right thing to do, then I stand by you and not the book. I mean, just what courage that takes. And interesting, you talk about the push and the pull of the challenges of so much that could exist in that. But what an opportunity. If we're reimagining policing, this might be the time for it.
And we don't, because the legalistic model gives all of the players a safe place to retreat to. They can, if they can retreat back to, well, I was authorized to do this. The law or policy permits me to do this. But sometimes I think we all lose sight of the fact that when it's you, and to use your analogy about the book or the right thing, if we think we did the right thing, that's what we want our leaders to say. We want to say, oh yeah, we understand that. We need to challenge ourselves to do the same thing.
Well, Barney, as you know, Blue Courage was founded with the belief that the answers to policing's greatest challenges will most likely be found through thought leaders from outside of the profession. With all of your education and experience in policing, is there a question that you would like to ask our cultural anthropologist panelists that could help us to frame our understanding of police culture so that we can enhance it in the immediate future?
There is. I mean, I think very clearly the issue of race in the police is on the forefront of every discussion and everyone's mind in this country today. And it occurred to me when I went to Pasadena, which is a fascinating city to work in. It's multiracial. It's home to the oldest African American community in Southern California. It's a majority minority city, and it's got a complicated history, much like America. And it occurred to me as we sent young officers out into the field, particularly into Northwest Pasadena, which is predominantly African American. It's where Jackie Robinson, among other people, grew up. They sent them into the field. These young 25-year-olds are going out into the field with the best of intentions. They want to do good. They've been imbued with the ideals of the profession, and they're going into a community who can tell you stories about when they were not allowed to swim in the municipal pool, about when they were not allowed to walk east of a certain street after dark. And you can't find those rules in a city council order. You can't find it in an ordinance. But nevertheless, everybody understood that's what the rules were, and everybody understood that the police were in some way going to be involved in enforcing those rules. And it occurred to me that what you had was a collision of narratives. You had this historical narrative on the behalf of the community, and you had this idealistic narrative that these young officers were imbued in, and these narratives collided. And I would ask, what advice our academic thought leaders would say for police leaders that are trying to find a way to bridge those narratives?
Oh, Robert, you're on mute.
Sorry. I believe that anthropology is really a great analytical tool to help us to become more self-aware. And because a lot of times what happens is culture masquerades as nature. So people take their interpretive perspective and believe it's a universal perspective, or that it's wholly based in facts, when a lot of times it's based on a lot of blindness and a certain type of limited understanding. So as a analytical perspective, it can help you to get beyond your own sort of limited thinking and try to, one, consider what the person you're interacting is maybe thinking about, how they may be seeing the same set of facts, but coming to a different conclusion. And it also helps us to think about how to design interventions to bridge those misunderstandings that occur from that collision of narratives. And I think that even the identification of the fact that these various communities have different narratives going on that don't quite align and mesh together is a great insight from a cultural frame. It is a great way to understand how, once you understand that, you can kind of figure out, well, maybe there's ways to give that 25-year-old a better historical grounding so they can understand how race and the community have articulated themselves across time. In the same way, you can sort of institute things like a citizens police academy to allow the community to gain greater insights into how policing happens and to be on the same page and create consensus. And this kind of reminds me, I was reading a story about, you were talking about Eldridge Cleaver and a great aha moment that you had. And I was wondering if you might want to share that story.
Many years ago, when I was in Pasadena, and through my good, okay. I had occasion to invite Eldridge Cleaver to come to the Pasadena Police Department to speak to the officers and to talk about race and police and all of the things that society struggled with. And he was very gracious and agreed to do that. And we had breakfast before I took him down to the auditorium to speak. And I commented that I said, you've come a long way from the days when you hated the cops in Oakland. And he looked at me and he was very serious. And he said, I didn't hate the cops. And I was very surprised at that. And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, we didn't hate the cops. He said, we hated the government. He said, it was just that the cops were the only arm of government we ever saw. He said, and 10% of them were wonderful human beings, and 10% of them were awful. He uses stronger language than that. And 80% of them that are in the middle, just people trying to do their job, but they were the government. And that's when it struck me that the reality of policing, and I think it's one of the things that young officers don't get enough of awareness of the fact that they make a huge difference in ways they don't even begin to understand in the lives of everybody that they come in contact with. And that they are being judged, not just for themselves, not just for the policing profession, but for the reality, for the truth or falsity of the Constitution and everything we stand for. And I was very grateful to him for saying that.
Well, it's so very well said. I just love this idea. And in fact, apparently you had a collision of narratives as well, as you had told yourself that story of what you expected someone to say, and then were met with something different.
That's true.
Michael, just quickly with that, it's like, how do we put that into practice through a Blue Courage lens? And I think you talk often about how the highest levels of maturity require humility, collaboration, and even perhaps surrender from a place of strength. Is that the roadmap to basically get through this collision of narratives, at least for us that are held to the higher standard?
Well, I think there's a little bit more than that. And if you look at Stephen Covey's habits, he says that in habit 5, the ability to listen with no agenda, to be empathetic, to listen with your eyes and your heart as well as with your ears, is a precursor to the ability to become interdependent and collaborative. And we as a society, I suspect, are horrible listeners for most of the people, me included. I have to consciously tell myself, like Denzel Washington did in Philadelphia, explain it to me like I'm a 6-year-old. When I'm having a very important emotional conversation with somebody, I will always tell myself, assume that I don't understand and listen so that I can understand it. So I think we're unwilling to start from a place of ignorance. We're too willing to believe that our certainty is right. And I think we are way too certain in a world that is very uncertain. And one of the things I find about policing, and I always get a laugh with this in Blue Courage when I say, hey, how open-minded are police? And everybody chuckles because they know we're not. We tend to see things through a lens of black and white. Well, justice is found in 1,000 shades of gray. It's not found at the extremes. And that's why I believe discretion is the greatest tool that police officers have. So, but to get there, to get to that right place, I think we have to start with the premise that that we're not, the way we view the world is not the way everybody else views the world. I was struck by the NASCAR example with Bubba Watson, where they found what Bubba Watson and his team saw as a noose had been there for months, and it was a door holder. But because of the lens and the moment that we find ourselves in, one thing that we tend to see is, oh, wow, there's a noose, somebody hates me, when it was actually, in its most simple terms, functional. So I think our willingness, number one, to understand that we're not always right, we don't have all the answers, that we have to listen to get there, we have to understand, that's a part of surrender and acceptance. I think that eludes us too often in our profession.
The hard heart work.
And if somehow I could just interject one thing, Michael, because you bring a good point with that story. I think that in our training, we lose sight of the fact that there are really two things that if law enforcement officers, if all of us could, not just in law enforcement, but particularly, could learn how to say. And that's, the first one is, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I don't know the answer to this particular question. But somehow we've imbued this idea that, well, you have to know everything and you have to be on top of everything and you have to be in command of everything. And saying, I don't know, is problematic. And the other thing, and maybe even more importantly, is I'm sorry. Because if we could get to a place in our profession where we could, all of us, not just young officers, but all of us that have been in this business, your whole focus on culture, and you've made the point several times that we hire the best people. We hire the best people, but something sometimes happens to them in that journey through the profession. if we could just teach them to say, I don't know, and I'm sorry, we'd move a long way, I think.
Absolutely.
Ken, I know you have a question for Barney.
Yeah, just to build off something we were talking about earlier around what anthropology may also contribute to this conversation, because it's a rich conversation with a lot of contributors. I think part of what we may be able to bring to this is the perspective around how we have multiple ways of interacting, which means that we have a very on-stage way of interacting, and then we also have off-stage ways of interacting. And all of that together ultimately leads to what we understand our culture to be collectively. So another way of saying that, which we talked about earlier, is the kind of the distinction between the ideal culture and the real culture, or the formal and the informal. And I see at least that that, as in every culture, is very much at play as well in policing. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit from your experience, with a view toward how do we want to move the formal and informal toward potentially a more values-based model?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a challenge, and it's not a coincidence that the notion of values-based disciplinary systems and values-based policies are really not the norm, because it's hard, and it's very hard, particularly in a legalistic world, and in a litigious world that we live in, which drives people into these corners where things need to be very specific and very well articulated. And the informal, if you're trying to merge the formal and the informal culture, I think you want people to do the right thing, and the right thing I'm defining as being in conformance with those formal and official values. If you want to do the right thing, then you have to have room for failure in there, and you have to have this vast shade of gray. And the legal system that we have doesn't necessarily allow that. And in implementing values-based discipline, there were really sort of 4 quadrants that had to be resolved, and 2 of them were easy. You know, one is when the values and the policy are in alignment. Your actions were in conformity with values, conformity with policies. That's easy. The other one that's easy is when your values were not in conformance with, or when your actions were not in conformance with values, and they weren't in conformance with policy either. That's easy. Hmm. If your values were in conformance with, if your actions were in conformance with values, but they violated policy, that conflict that Michael talked about your actions versus the book, that's where the system can operate, where this notion of you set up a process to protect individuals, you can say you're good to go this time because these were the right things to do. It gets a little tricky in terms of precedent and some other things that we talk about, but it's doable. The really challenging one, the really challenging one for the system that we live in, and it really goes to the discussion that we're trying to have right now in the aftermath of the tragedy of George Floyd, is what do you do when the officer's actions are in conformance with policy and or law, but we know they're wrong. The technical or untechnical term for that is lawful but awful. We know that was the wrong thing to do, but somehow policy and law say that it's okay. And that transition point, the figuring out of how to navigate that, is not one I think that, certainly I didn't in Pasadena, because I never had to face it. I know that in when I talked to the chiefs from Boulder and Wheaton, they both said it didn't come up very much and they were able to work through it. But I think there isn't, I'm taking a long way to answer your question, because I think the problem is whatever we do in this realm has to integrate with the legal system. And whether we like it or not, we cannot sort of operate outside of it. And so we have to figure out how to bring those 2 things together. And I think that one quadrant gets to be very problematic. And it's probably the most important one in terms of the national conversation we're having today.
And just to follow up on that, Barney, you know, we had spoken yesterday, and you were talking a little bit about the myths of policing, and I think one of those is whether we're a paramilitary type of a profession or not. But you know, where do we go from there? Like, how do we make sense of the myths of policing that we take are true, while at the same time not trying to bend the map in order to create the way forward or a justification for the way forward? I loved your phrase, bending the map. Maybe you could talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, and I'd like to take credit for inventing that phrase, but it really came from the author Lawrence Gonzalez in his book Deep Survival, and it talks about people who find themselves lost in the woods or lost while backpacking, and they have a map, and all of a sudden that they realize that their map, what they're looking at on their map, isn't matching up with what they're seeing on the ground. And the author's point is that there's this human tendency to start to move the map around until you can justify, oh, I'm not really lost. I'm here. You know, here's where I am, because they've turned the map around, and they're wrong. Well, in some ways, we do that with our own actions. We know that we have these ideals. We know that we have these standards that we're supposed to meet and we're supposed to live up to, and we know we don't always do it. One of the things that I love the most about this job, actually two things, but one of them is that you get tested every day. You get tested physically, you get tested emotionally, you get tested morally. And some days you succeed, hopefully most days you succeed, and some days you fail. But in order for that whole thing to work, you have to be self-aware enough to know that you were taking a test. You have to know that you're looking at a map and the map's not lining up. Or to take it one step up, you're looking at the values. You're looking at what you know is right, and you realize you're not matching up. And at that point, you have this choice, and you get to say, oh, well, I guess I better, you know, reorient myself and figure out where I really am. Or you can start moving the map around until you can figure, oh yeah, you know what I'm doing is okay. What I'm doing is okay. The tragedy in Minneapolis was even worse than the officer who killed George Floyd, was the officers who stood there and did not intervene. That they were bending the map in some fashion, because they knew on some core level, they knew that this was wrong, but they didn't do anything. And so that bending the map concept, I think is important to what we're talking about today.
Michael.
You know, Barney, we've had so many conversations, and many times in our conversations, you support the effort that we are making in Blue Courage to create healthy officers, healthy of mind, body, heart, and spirit. And you often speak so eloquently about quoting Joseph Wamba about the corrosion of our soul and spirit. Could you share that with us? I mean, many people probably don't even know who Joseph Wamba is today, currently in policing, but we certainly do. And also, just as a follow-on, could you talk about the importance of courage in all of this discussion on culture?
Yeah, Joseph Wamba in his book, The New Centurions, and I had to laugh when you said some people might not know who Joseph Wamba is. When I was teaching classes a few years ago, I made some reference to, I think, to Joseph Wamba. And I realized from the blank looks that I was getting that people didn't know who I was talking about, which was a sign of the passage of time, I think, as much as anything else. But, you know, Wamba said that the greatest danger to a police officer was not a criminal's bullet or a speeding car. He said it was the daily drop of corrosion on the human soul. And what I think he was referring to, and I think what gets lost in a lot of this national narrative, is that what law enforcement officers do every day and who they deal with every day. And I think one of the most moving stories, and every officer's done it, and to investigate the death of a child. And it was not a criminal matter in any way, shape, or form. It was just a tragic death. And the mother, as we were doing our business and all this, you know, she was holding it together, but then at the end she lost it, and she she was very hysterical, and she grabbed my badge. I thought she was going to rip it off my shirt. And she said, "Why did my child die?" Because the assumption was that somehow I would know that somehow I could explain this awfulness to her. And I think we all come into this business with the idea that we are going to make a difference in the lives of everybody we come in contact with, that we're going to be able to dispense justice and rightness and all those things. And the truth of the matter is we discover that we can't. And we see the worst sometimes of humanity. We also see the best, and sometimes we don't always focus on that. But we certainly see the worst of what people are capable of doing, and that's the daily drop of corrosion. Michael talks brilliantly about this idea that cynicism is the new corruption, and I've always taken that to heart, that this letting this cynicism, letting that corrosion seep into your soul, is the greatest danger of an officer. Now, with respect to courage, I think that we emphasize in our training and in what we do, we emphasize the notion of physical courage. You will run to the sound of gunfire. You will enter a residence where something frightening is going on. You will engage someone who's 50% again bigger than you are, if you need to, because we understand that kind of courage, but we don't always understand the totality of courage. We don't understand the courage of saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to allow myself to get drawn into this. I don't have to prove anything about this. I am going to intervene. I am going to have the courage to intervene with my partners. I am going to have the courage to speak up in roll call and say, whatever it is that we're talking about, I'm going to have the courage to express a contrary view. So I think law enforcement officers don't lack courage, but sometimes we define it way too narrowly.
Barney, thank you so much. Just an amazing discussion. I'll turn now to Ken, then Robert, then Michael. Closing thoughts. And from this discussion and even the last couple, are we on the right path? Are we asking the right questions in these webinars now that we're on our third, that are leading us to better shape and define and to heal some pain and grow some culture? Maybe Ken, I'll start with you.
My initial comment, I think, at the very beginning of all this is how humbled I feel by entering this conversation with you all and with everybody who is joining us as participants. That is stronger now than ever, I think, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think the topic of acculturation, which we were broadly talking about today, was entered in a really fascinating way. And part of what I could hear if we talked about the not good 10%, the really great 10%, and the 80% trying to get through it all. That's our culture. And I think everybody comes into it with a feeling that, I know why I am an officer. I know why I chose this. And being able to see what's happening to people's experience from that moment of knowing why I'm going into it to what happens over the course of a career. To me, it was a fascinating and again, humbling entry to that discussion about what it means to work in the culture.
Thank you, Ken. Robert.
Every conversation that we have, I'm reminded about how internally police officers and police leaders are thinking about change, and that this is not a new discussion. This is an ongoing discussion, because in every profession, folks operate at that intersection between the sort of rules and values. And it's through self-awareness, the organizational self-awareness and the individual self-awareness, that we get to most successfully operate between and in the middle of those two endpoints. So I'm really hopeful about the future of policing and where we're going, and that I think policing can lean into the moment that we are faced with now.
And Michael.
Yeah, when I'm asked by friends and family about some of the things that are on the news about policing and why can't the police just do this, or, how are you trained? One of the things I always say is policing is very complicated. And I think our discussion today really begins to paint that out. And we have to have deep thinking to sort through those complexities and to get to the realities of how we improve policing. You can't just make policy. You can't just say we're going to have cultural reform. You can't just say let's change the leadership or let's defund. This is very complicated, and I think the end vision, and I'm just really reinforcing this by listening to Barney today, is we have to make an intellectual and a heartfelt investment on all sides, from government officials to community to police, to be willing to surrender and look at internally, ask the hard questions, because the answers are there. There's brilliant minds in this profession, as you see from some of the people who have come on the show and many who have not. So if we can be humble and proceed with a little bit of grace, the answers are there, and hopefully we will keep exploring, digging deeper on this this webinar series so we can get to those answers.
Michael, Ken, Robert, and of course Barney, thank you all very much. Back to you, Becky.
Thank you to all of our panelists for taking time to share your wisdom with us today. We greatly appreciate it. I want to remind everyone that this will be, it has been recorded, so it will be posted on Facebook and on YouTube, so you can watch the recording again. And I invite everyone to go to the webpage growblueculture.com, www.growblueculture.com. You can download the recordings there also, and past recordings of the previous webinars that we've done. And please, we invite everyone to register and join us again for this Friday. We will be doing another Exploring Blue Culture webinar, from training to education. And our guest host, or our guest will be Chief Sylvia Moyer, and she's from the Tempe Police Department. So again, we hope to see you all here again with us on Friday, and have a wonderful rest of your week, everyone.